Okay, so we're going to be reacting to a podcast with Coleman Hughes and his guest Peter Beinart, who's a journalist. He has written many articles and op-eds on Israel-Palestine. He used to be a supporter of the two-state solution, and now he believes in one state. But the understanding I have is that he doesn't believe in a particular Jewish state. So we're going to hop right into it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, like the video. Follow me at Rafi the Realtor for all of your South Florida real estate needs. And you can go support the channel at the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Let's go.
Wanting to go back to the places they were from. But when you actually meet Palestinian refugees and you see how deeply they love the places they were born, every bit as strong a connection, as profound a connection as Jews do to that places, I began to find that it was just seemed to me morally untenable to say to a Palestinian refugee, a Jew like me can return after 2,000 years, but you can't return to the place that you were expelled from after 75 years. And I also, and in order to maintain a Jewish ethnic demographic majority, I don't believe in the idea that states should have policies that treat people differently in order to try to preserve a particular racial, ethnic, religious demography. That's the reason I disagree with Tucker Carlson about the United States.
This is the definition of Ashkenazi academic idiocy. It is just, the more I talk about it, the more I see it over and 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 over again. This moral this moral retardation. That's what it is. He is just he's such a weakling that he doesn't apply the idea of tribalism, the idea of familial connection, the idea that human beings want to be surrounded by like-minded people who share their interests and their values. It is natural that you're going to have ethnostates. The idea of an ethnostate, the fact that we even call them ethnostates, is it's redundant. Most countries operate well because they are made up of primarily of a primary pardon me, they are primarily made up of a group of people indigenous to that parcel of land that have a connection to it, that have desire to live there, that are willing to fight and die for it. You're going to have like-minded people who want to be around those same people. They want to be with their family members, and they're going to oppose people who have opposing views. This is natural. The United States works as a framework because most of us in the US, aside from Native Americans, understand that none of us are indigenous to this land. We're all here to succeed and hope for the American dream with a white picket fence, a golden retriever, and a couple of kids. And that is effectively what we all understand fundamentally as Americans, that America is a melting pot that was built off of removing the Native Americans from this land. That's what the United States is, and it works wonderfully for what it is. But when you have countries like in the Middle East, even in Latin America, you can mix the pot to a certain extent, but you cannot remove the identity of the primary group. Yemen is primarily made up of Yemenis. Are there are there different tribes of Yemenis? Is there some level of genetic mixture among Yemenis? I'm sure if you go all the way to the east versus all the way to the west, you may have some lighter Yemenis, some darker Yemenis. You might have more of an African mixture versus maybe more of an Arab mixture. But the overall population of Yemen is more or less, they might not be in agreement politically, but they speak Arabic, they they eat gat, they listen to the same music, they eat the same food, and that's what works. And that's what works for the majority of the world. So this idea that we're supposed to forego all of that and try to create the same framework around the entire world as we have in the United States. It doesn't work. We're seeing in Europe how that's destroying Europe because you're having these migrants come into the country and they're trying to change the way of the country. England, it's not working for England, for France, for Sweden. It doesn't work. Poland understands this, and Poland's not allowing it to happen. So, I'm not going to jump to conclusions as to what Peter's about to say, but it sounds pretty evident that he's going to try to diminish the importance of what a Jewish state means in the Holy Land, right? The same way where so much of the world tries to diminish the Jewish connection to Judea and Samaria. I digress.
So let's I guess start with the refugee issue. You mentioned, and you have an essay to this effect, that it's inconsistent to say that Jews have the right to return to Israel after however many thousands of years of exile, and then on the other hand, deny that Palestinians have the right to live where either they or in some cases their parents or grandparents lived in the 1940s. So to me, that argument is a straw man of the reason it made sense for Jews, the reason it's defensible that Jews migrated and started a state in historic Palestine. In other words, I'm not Jewish. I've no religious attachments or no religious ideas that any land belongs to any people. This is something I, as an atheist, just view as kind of nonsense that is meaningful to people. But so like I would never defend Jews who migrated to Israel in the 1940s or 30s, say, because they had a permanent right of return in the Torah, right? That's not the reason I would defend that choice. The reason I would defend that choice is because they were refugees with nowhere to go. Many of them, as you know, were refugees from pogroms in Eastern Europe. In the 1930s and 40s, were refugees from Nazi Germany and from genocide. And they couldn't come to America for the most part. In fact, they did come to America until they couldn't. They couldn't come to Canada. And there was one place in the world that was saying, our job is to protect you. We're building a state to protect you in an immediate political context where you are being genocided and driven out of virtually every country that you're living in, right? So for me, that's the reason why it's defensible. And I would defend the idea that the Jews would migrate to Palestine and attempt to start a Jewish state in the 1940s, not because I believe in an abstract, permanent right of return to wherever your ancestors lived, right? So to actually make that symmetrical with the situation of the Palestinian diaspora at this moment, it would have to be the case that Palestinians weren't safe in the rest of the world, right? To actually make that similar historically. If you were able to tell me that Palestinians in Jordan, Palestinians living in the West, right, were so unsafe in these countries that the only place that will protect them is their home of the 1940s or 50s, then I think you'd be making an analogous case and you could charge me with hypocrisy. But absent that, I think the cases are quite different. There are in my view, there's no right in international law or in any ethics worth having to return to where your ancestors were living in the 1940s, right? And if we actually did that, the level of chaos it would create, there would be immediately 100 million people, something like that, around Earth, on every continent that would now have the right to live in a different country because their ancestors were expelled in the 1940s. As you know, the 750,000 or so.
That is such a good point. Coleman, it's just, you answered that beautifully. Palestinians in Chicago don't have to worry about, being attacked. They have Little Palestine in Paterson, New Jersey. I believe it was literally just named Little Palestine officially as of maybe a couple of months ago. The Jews need a state. We absolutely need a state. So if you want to remove religion from the equation, just on the basis of us needing to protect ourselves, that's enough. And I love what he said. If we're going to start trying to bring everyone back to their so-called ancestral homeland, I mean, where does it end? Anyone living in the U.S. would have to, if not give up their country, they'd have to, at the very least have to make a lot of concessions.
And so what you're describing in Israel is at a far extreme from the different examples you're giving.
So what about a case like Japan, which has de facto a zero immigration policy, whether or not it's explicitly justified in terms of maintaining a Japanese demographic majority? That's what it is. What do you make of a policy like that?
I mean, my understanding is that people can apply for citizenship in Japan. It's true, Japan doesn't like taking a lot of immigrants. I don't think that's probably particularly good for Japan, but there's no equivalent in Japan of Japan expelling 750,000 people and basically saying, none of you can return and none of your ancestors can return, but a Japanese person whose family has not lived there for 2,000 years can. Again, I don't think you can find any equivalent for that.
The expulsion, though, has to be judged in the context of a war that was started by Palestinians.
Sorry, right? Just tell me what you mean by that.
The expulsions you're referring to, presumably in the 1940s, in the late 1940s, of Palestinian families, yes?
Well, there was also a huge expulsion in 1967 as well. But what do you mean when you say the Palestinians started it?
My understanding, having read the historian Betty Morris, is that the first acts of violence in what became the Civil War in November 1947 were Palestinian attacks on Jewish members of the Yishuv in November. Do you share that?
You're referring to the November?
We don't have to get too into the weeds because this might be
no, but it's
people,
I think it's really important. I think you're referring to the November 30th attack on the Egged bus that was going from Netanya to Jerusalem, right? Mm-hmm. Well, actually, Benny Morris himself, in his book 1948, says that it's probable that was a retaliation. That was the first attack. You're right. After the UN partition, November 30th. But Morris himself, in his book 1948, says it was likely in retaliation for a November 19th attack by Lehi on a Palestinian family that killed 5 people. So it's just not true to say that the Palestinians started it. I've actually heard you say this a number of times. What you had was internecine conflict, absolutely conflict between violence by Jews, violence by Palestinians, also violence against the British and by the British. But it's just simply not true to say that the Palestinians started it in the way you did.
So what would you attribute
It's also disingenuous to separate Jews from Palestinians at that point. It was Jews and Arabs, because the Jews were just as Palestinian at that time as anyone else. The Palestinians and Jews only became separate entities once the State of Israel was established, and the Arabs decided to identify themselves as Palestinians.
You say started it?
I think what you had was everyone knew the British were leaving. And you had internecine violence. You had violence by Palestinian militias against Jewish communities. You also had violence by Irgun and Lehi Jewish militias against Palestinians. You had violence against the British because by both sides, which didn't like the British there very much. And then after the partition plan happens, Israel decides that it needs to change the demography of the Jewish state because there are way too many Palestinians there, and go about ethnically cleansing large Palestinian territories before the Arab armies attack and Israel declares independence in May 1948.
So in general, though, the idea that a country almost every country on earth wants to preserve its demographic majority. Israel has additional security reasons why, like Italy's desire to remain majority Italian and give every Italian automatic citizenship. It's kind of just the desires of the Italian population, right? It's not like they're deeply worried about terror from Poles, right, or from non-Italians. But Israel has an additional reason that makes it more justifiable, in my view, than a country like Japan or Italy or Ireland, and ultimately, I don't feel I am in the business of judging a democracy's views on its own immigration policy, in particular where security is involved, even if they're not my own, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
I take issue with your use of the word democracy. Israel is a democracy for Jews. It's a pretty robust liberal democracy for its Jews. It's not a democracy for Palestinians. Most of the Palestinians who live under Israeli control, those in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, are not citizens. In the West Bank and Gaza, they can't become citizens. In the West Bank, they live under a totally different legal system.
Right, but that's also not part of the country. Of course, they're not citizens because the West Bank and Gaza are not officially under the state of Israel right now. So they are occupied territories. That's what they are. Now, under in Israel proper, these so-called Palestinians are citizens and do have rights. They have equal rights. Are they treated with the exact same interest by the Israeli government as the Jews? No, you could argue not. I wouldn't call them second class citizens though. They're not paying a jizya, they're not dhimmis. They don't have these laws that discriminate against them. They hold all kinds of positions in the military and in hospitals and schools. They're lawyers. They hold every role. They're in the Knesset. I mean, what else do you want? The Arabs have far more upward mobility than they do in any of the Arab countries. They don't have to wear hijabs. They can be gay. They can do anything they want. I mean, Peter knows this. I don't know why Peter's disregarding all of this.
So I don't quibble with you when you say that and emphasize, and I think you're perfectly right to emphasize that Palestinians in the territories don't have equal rights. They are subject to laws that they can't change or vote for. All of those things are right. And in an ideal world, I would like I like equality. I mean, equality is very important. It's a very important principle, but I don't think that when it comes to geopolitics, you should blindly follow the principle that sounds right in most cases, regardless of what the likely consequences are. And in this case, I think the very likely, overwhelmingly likely consequence in the case of a binational state, I mean, you suggested it could be, it could be called something like Israel-Palestine, right? Or like a binational state where everyone has equal rights. I think the very likely outcome of that at this moment, at this particular time, would be an extremely bloody civil war, civil conflict. And and so I can't blindly sign off on that as if it's a good outcome for all the people that live between the river and the sea, and that's my basic view of it.
Right. So my response would be there is one state now. Israel controls all the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan in different ways, right? And most of the Palestinians under its control don't even have citizenship. So Jews and Palestinians are living alongside each other in one state in a condition where one group has legal rights and the other group doesn't. And that I actually think is a much less safe reality for everybody. I think systems that give everybody representation in government are actually much safer because everyone has a nonviolent mechanism for having the government listen to them. And I think that, this is very difficult often for people who are on top to recognize, right? White South Africans were convinced that if it was a black government, then Mkhonto we Sizwe, the military.
You got to stop comparing it to South Africa because you're insinuating that the Jews are South Africans and they don't belong there. See, the problem with Peter Beinart, since so many Ashkenazi Jews, is he negates the fact that he may have had ancestors that were killed in the Holocaust for not being seen as pure Europeans, but to Peter Beinart, he's a white man. He, I don't think he sees himself as an ethnic Jew. I don't think maybe he does in some part of his mind, but I think day to day he just sees himself as a regular white American man. And so to him, this whole idea of Israel and Jews, it's a foreign concept to him. It's like, oh, the Middle Eastern people in a squabble. They're fighting each other. I have no part to play in this. I'm just an American white man. And he doesn't he's not connecting it. He's not making the proper connection. Jews who don't have a deep core identity, don't understand who they are in principle, constantly make this mistake. And so Israel should be a democracy, but not at the expense of its security. It should be a democracy so long as its Jewish citizens are safer and protected. That has to be its first and foremost priority. It should also make it a priority to ensure the security and protection of everyone living in Israel as Israelis. However, it as a Jewish state, that was the reason it was established, is to first and foremost prioritize the Jewish. It is a Jewish democracy, and that is what it needs to be. It cannot be a democratic melting pot like the United States. It has to prioritize its Jewish citizens. That is the only way it can remain a Jewish state. So it can't get lost in the sauce about democracy, this, democracy, that. Not if it's going to hurt its Jewish majority. That's just how it is. And that's no other country in the Middle East works any differently. In fact, the countries in the Middle East are not democratic at all. So that is the story there. Uh see. Also, he's mentioning that all people should have, in the West Bank and Gaza, for example, should have also the ability to vote and all those other things. Israel can't take that chance. They can't take that chance. They're going to be the minority in their own country. That's a non-negotiable. That cannot happen. Uh, these American Ashkenazi Jews expect Israel to make decisions that would potentially highly likely lead to its suicide. Enough already. Like they're such dumb. They really, I hate to throw ad hominems and throw insults, but just the level of stupidity is it's unbelievable. It's always these academics too. These articulate, well-spoken, well-read people who, seem to know history, but are so incredibly dumb. So dumb. They can't figure out why would they think like this. It's so insane to me. Because what they do is they put their shoe on other people's feet and expect them to fit. Well, if I'm a 10 and a half, everyone else must be a 10 and a half. If I think with morality and I have good intentions, well, everyone else should also have good intentions. I mean, well, we're all human, aren't we? Can't we all just get along? It seems so brilliant until you fucking, I can't even, I don't know. I don't know. I would like to talk to this guy though. I really would. Hopefully knock some sense into him. But this plagues so many Jews, man. So many Jews have this problem. Like, unfortunately, the Gazans don't want to sit with us in parliament and sing kumbaya with us. They can be residents, not citizens, residents, no voting rights. Live in the land, behave, cooperate, and we can give you upward mobility. You have a police force, have a sanitation department, irrigation, agriculture. Fantastic. Herd your sheep, live your lives. You will not commit terrorism. You will not go against the country. You will abide by our laws, and you will do what you need to do. That's it. You don't like it, fuck off and go somewhere else. Too fucking bad. Like we need to be willing to say these things. In the Arab world, they don't have. You think it'd be better for Jews in the Arab world? We have to give them exactly the same things, despite the fact that they're on a mission to annihilate us. We should totally throw that all out the window, trust them completely, and give them complete equality with the Jewish population, expecting that they have the exact same interests that we do. Insanity. Insanity. So we should put our lives at risk because they might feel a certain way. Oh, they might not have this exactly what we do. Oh, no.
Wing of the ANC would slaughter them. But once Black South Africans had the right to vote, actually, Mkhonto Wesizwe put away its weapons. Protestants in Northern Ireland convinced that the IRA would slaughter them if they didn't control the police force and the military. But the IRA put away its weapons.
very different because this entire war between the Palestinians and Israelis is foundationally about religion. You can't compare these other conflicts. You also can't compare white South Africa to black South Africa because the white South Africans have no historical connection to it. They have no religious, historical, they don't have those claims. So, and first of all, South Africa is still a very dangerous country. If you live in white South Africa, you have to be you have to build these huge fences, these huge walls around your houses. You need security guards to make it as if they're equal arguments. They're totally different.
Even in Israel-Palestine itself, we can see that Israeli Jews are far less afraid of Palestinian citizens than they are of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. There's something always kind of funny to me about the fact that Israeli Jews who would be terrified to go unarmed into Gaza go onto operating tables in Israel all the time at their most vulnerable and have literally Palestinian doctors and nurses wielding sharp objects over them while they're most vulnerable. Why are those Palestinians so much less of a threat to them? I think a lot of it is that those Palestinians actually have citizenship and the right to vote, even
Yes, but you also have to take into account that that's 21% of the population, which is, by the way, a huge percentage. But if we were to bring the Gazans and the West Bank uh, Arabs into Israel, that demographic would become. I mean, there would be probably more of. If there wouldn't be more of them, they'd be very close to it. That changes things dramatically because even though you have Arab Israelis who are okay with the state, there are still many of them that would love to see the state destroyed. They're crazy. They're out of their minds because living under Jewish rule gives them tremendously more upward mobility and opportunity. But because of their deep religious beliefs, they would still be willing to forego everything they have in the establishment of an Islamic state. So if they have millions of additional Palestinians with citizenship, and now they could potentially vote in Arab leaders who can dissolve the country, there's a very high probability that they would do that. Like you already have Ayman Odeh, you have I'm forgetting names of some of these guys already, but these are staunchly anti-Israel Knesset members. You think no one in the Arab population agrees with them? Plenty of them do. You have plenty of attacks that happen within Israel proper by Palestinians. Like Peter Beinart is totally ignoring that.
though they're very severely discriminated against. I think there's less violence and more safety for everybody when everyone has a nonviolent way of getting the state to listen to them. And I think political science literature actually bears that out.
So I would disagree there. I think it very much depends on the specifics of the case. So we view South Africa as mostly a success story, ending apartheid there. But I think in the case of Israel-Palestine, because of the facts on the ground, a one-state reality would probably not end up like South Africa. It would be much more likely to end up like Sudan or Liberia or Lebanon or Iraq. There are many cases where the franchise and political rights have been extended, and it hasn't resulted in kumbaya or even kumbaya with an asterisk, but has resulted in brutal and bloody civil wars. And so to me, it is, and I don't mean this in an overly combative way, but I do think it's intellectually lazy to assume that the right principle, right, the principle that like we live by in America would just lead to good results. And that's what the political science literature suggests. And you don't have to look at the specifics of the case. I want to make a point about South Africa because the South Africa analogy, it does a lot of logical work, I think, not only in your argument specifically, but in the way a lot of people think about this issue. And it's superficially persuasive. But the moment you drill down on the details and the differences between South Africa and Israel, you start to notice at minimum one very key difference, which is that in South Africa, there was no second intifada, by which I mean there was no sustained terror campaign on the scale of what Palestinian jihadists did to Jews in the early 2000s. Nothing at that scale, nothing at that level of sustain. And perhaps more importantly than that, the faction in South Africa that wanted to do a kind of second intifada against whites was the APLA, the Azanian People's Liberation Army. And when push came to shove in the 90s, they got a whopping 1% of the South African vote, meaning they did not have very much support among South African blacks. South African blacks by far preferred Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, which, though it had its problems with violence, in principle and in practice condemned violence against targeting, did not systematically target white civilians, and did not preach the extreme type of violence that the APLA did. So if we're going to make the kind of superficial historical analogy, the APLA was the Hamas equivalent in South Africa, and they got 1% of the vote. So compare that to Palestinian politics today. Unfortunately, it is not the case that Hamas gets 1% of the support among Palestinians. Hamas is, they get a plurality at minimum. They're the most popular political faction, certainly in the West Bank at this point. I don't know what the numbers in Gaza say at the moment. But all of that tells you something very important about the differences in the current aspirations of the Palestinians as compared with the aspirations of South African blacks in the 1990s, and therefore tells you something about the likelihood of success in the event of dissolving the security apparatus.
That's a wonderful answer. Coleman, spot on, dude. Very, very well said.
Yeah. I would really encourage you to have a South African guest who was involved in the ANC, because actually what I think it's not a coincidence that the pretty much entire South African political leadership has a view of this, which is a lot closer to mine than it is to you. I think in retrospect, there's a way in which we kind of sanitize what happened in apartheid South Africa. The ANC, as you acknowledge, was not a nonviolent organization. Nelson Mandela helped turn the organization towards embracing armed resistance. It was common at South African rallies, including ANC rallies, to hear chants like "One settler, one bullet, kill the Boer." The ANC was defined as a terrorist organization by the United States. It was getting its weapons from the Soviet Union. You are correct that the ANC was more able to hold the line against targeting civilians than Hamas has. That's absolutely correct. But it's also important to remember that happens in a particular context, right? First of all, apartheid ends much, much sooner in South Africa than it did in Israel-Palestine. We don't know what would have happened. I think it would have been much harder for them to hold that line had apartheid lasted for another 40 years. The second thing, and this is really critical, one of the really important reasons that the ANC was able to hold the line on targeting civilians, because there was lots of support among Black South Africans for going after white civilians, was that they were getting support from the world, that their boycott, divestment, sanctions effort was actually gaining traction. So they were able to show Black South Africans that there was a path which didn't rely primarily on violence, that was succeeding. They also had the advantage of the labor power, because Black South African trade unions were much more powerful in South Africa because South Africa relied on Black labor. But so the question I would turn around to you is, if you and I agree, we don't want Palestinian civilians to use violence. I think one of the reasons the ANC was able to restrain that impetus in Black South African politics was because their efforts at pushing international pressure on South Africa were working, that their nonviolent efforts were working. And the question I'm curious to ask you is, what Palestinian nonviolent efforts at overcoming a system that you have acknowledged is oppressive would you support?
The problem is the Israelis are not going to trust the nonviolent efforts, because there's already been so many instances of violent efforts. So for Israel now to just trust that they mean well and create, it's not a smart decision. It's not a smart decision. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, however you want, however the saying goes. But you're not going to fool me 3 times. As fool me 3 times, fuck the peace sign, something, chop a let it rain on you. You're not gonna like. You've already done the damage. Like the Jewish population is not going to trust them that suddenly they want peace. Once Israel has full sovereignty over the entire country, then they can start kind of filtering things out, seeing who supports who, deciding really who's peaceful. But to just create a second state and hope that it works, it's a terrible idea. Because even if 10% of the population of the Palestinians, of the Gazan and West Bank Palestinians, are violent, they're going to control everyone else. But it's not likely to happen. It's much more likely that more than 50% are going to support that violent group.
What do you think about Palestinian nonviolent marches? Like, they've been having them for years and years and years. They were in Bil'in, in Nabi Salah, the Great March of Return. How do you think the U.S. should respond to those?
I think nonviolent marches are good, and that should be the main strategy of the movement, as it was in the civil rights movement. But my question for you
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
So, and then I'm sorry. My question, I guess, is how do you think the United States should respond when Israel treats nonviolent protests as it does, right? By shooting large numbers of people, spraying and holding them in indefinite detention. Do you think that we should then, for instance, put restrictions on the use of our weapons because Israel is using its weapons to kill and maim and imprison people who are protesting nonviolently?
I think that I'm not sure that can be separated from the general terror campaign that
But we're talking about nonviolent
accompanies
protests.
and is mixed. Yeah, to the extent that you have a purely nonviolent protest with no terrorists mixed in and then absolutely nobody should be firing on protesters. That should be condemned.
And we shouldn't give Israel the weapons to do that.
What do you mean the weapons to do that?
Well, because oftentimes Israel is using
we're not
our
giving
weapons.
them weapons for any particular. We're not giving any
maybe we
country
should say
weapons
that
to fire on protesters.
What about if we say that if Israel uses American-made weapons to fire or detain unarmed protesters, nonviolent protesters, there should be consequences in terms of America's willingness to continue to give Israel those weapons? How else are we going to get Israel to stop acting that way?
If we want to have that policy with the entire world, I'd be fine with it.
But we're not talking about the world. We're talking about Israel.
But obviously, our choice to sell weapons to a country is determined by about 20 factors at once that have to do with the entire geopolitical chessboard. So I'm not going to sign on to one simplistic principle in the abstract. But I want to ask you a question about the argument.
I think if you're willing to continue to sell Israel the weapons that it uses to kill unarmed protesters, then I don't think you really actually do believe in the principle of Palestinian. That you don't believe in the principle of nonviolence that you claim to believe in, because you're not willing to support it.
I don't believe in.
It's so interesting that like the staunchest pro-Palestinian voices are often Jews. It really goes to show you the width of our mode of thinking. You know, this goes back to Talmudic teaching. Just the ability for Jews to have so many different modes of thought. And as much as Peter Beinart's way of thinking annoys me because it's just so removed from reality, it's so utopian, I still respect that among the Jewish, we have such a beautiful ability to think in different ways. We're not stuck to one way of thinking, and that's what has allowed us to excel to such a large degree.
Simplistically and robotically applying a principle to every situation, no matter the specific context and consequences of applying the principle. So, but I want to ask you, so your part of your argument was that in South Africa, one reason that the ANC was effective is because, one reason the ANC was able to contain the violence against white civilians and police itself
and restrict it. Go ahead.
Is because it got so much support from the international community, right?
Yeah.
So given the fact that Palestinians have gotten so much support from the international community, which is to say massive protests in almost every European country and in America and Canada and Australia, the likes of which I think I'm not even quite sure we saw this level of sustained protest when it came to the Iraq war, though there were some big protests. Do you think are you saying that should moderate the level of violence against Hamas? Because clearly it didn't do that, right? Like in the midst of all those protests around the world, Hamas spokesmen come out and say, we're going to do October 7th again and again and again and again. In fact, it sort of looks like from the perspective of Hamas, which is not some 1% fringe, but probably the most popular faction in Palestinian politics, the level of support from the world has only affirmed the strategy of violence against Jewish civilians. It's working. Let's keep doing it, is the idea.
No, because what changed the ANC's calculation was not mass protests. It was change in government policy. The US, Europe imposed serious sanctions. The New York banks refused to roll over South Africa's loans, which caused economic crisis. There's no equivalent to that. If we saw that in Israel-Palestine, then I actually think that would have an impact. Because again, I talk to Palestinians about this all the time. I would love it if you'd interview Mohammed Shahada, for instance, who grew up in Gaza. One of the things that Mohammed has told me is that literally he had conversations with people in Hamas in which he made the argument for nonviolence, and they would say, listen, you guys have tried all of this nonviolence, none of it works. What mattered was that the ANC's program of BDS was changing government policy. We've seen nothing like that yet when it comes to Israel-Palestine.
So my assumption is the opposite. I think in this case, weakness is provocative. I mean, so for instance, and it looks like America might be headed that way, if we end our yearly aid to Israel for $4 billion a year plus extra during wars, if we end that essentially on your model of Palestinian militants, that would on the margin lead them to like back off of the violence because they would see that. Why wouldn't they interpret that as the net effect of the violence working, right?
Well, I think that
And by the way,
all,
sorry, last point. Okay. There are polls of Palestinians after the 2005 withdrawal from Gaza, which was like something like 80% of Palestinians viewed that as a success of the violence. In other words, as a success of Hamas's strategy.
Right, because that was why the 2005 withdrawal, why unilateral disengagement was such a bad idea, as opposed to a negotiated agreement. You basically undermine the Palestinian negotiators who were negotiating and who had abandoned armed resistance by not being willing to negotiate with them towards a deal.
No, Peter. So the reality is it would actually behoove the Palestinians more to be more peaceful, because that would have likely led to a two-state option, which then would allow them to keep fighting us. But this idea that either one would lead to a more peaceful resolution is not the case. Peaceful resistance, this whole concept of resistance is bullshit. They're not resisting anything. They're trying to take over. So, let's just call it resistance for the hilarity of it. But the peaceful resistance or the violent resistance, either or, at the end of the day, they're both equally effective and equally ineffective. The only way to peace is for Israel to establish complete sovereignty over the entire piece of land, remove or eliminate anyone who is committed to Israel's destruction, and then over the course of time create a re-education system and give the Palestinians that genuinely want peace upward mobility and economic opportunity. That's the only way to actually move forward.
We unilaterally withdraw and allow Hamas to say, look, it's our rockets that have succeeded, right? The fundamental problem with that, with all of these universal disengagement policies, is that they don't actually engage with Palestinians through a process that listens to Palestinians and what Palestinians wanted. And so I think that what Israel and the United States should do is, we know that the most popular Palestinian politician is Marwan Barghouti. He's been in jail for more than 2 decades. He's talked very explicitly about Mandela as his model. And we know that most of the most popular Palestinian politicians are in jail. Why not allow those people to leave jail, have Palestinian elections for a legitimate political process, right? And then negotiate on that basis with a legitimate Palestinian leadership.
So, it all sounds good on paper, but it only works. It only works if really the critical mass of Palestinians want to live in so you start out saying like 2-state versus 1-state is not so important to you as equality and political rights for all. So let's keep it to equality and political rights for all. Protection of religious minorities. Presumably, if there were a mass return of the Palestinian diaspora, that would lead to the Jews being a minority, right? Just to check that box.
Yeah, quite possibly. Right? Yeah. I mean, again, white South Africans are 10%.
At least it could conceivably. So,
sure.
So all of this only works if actually a critical mass of Palestinians want a society with equality, not just for themselves, but rather for everyone, right? And it's extremely disheartening. I mean, two things are very disheartening, and they're part of the core of the reason why I can't just sign on the dotted line on these ideas. One is the fact that there are, I think, literally 0 examples of Arab, Muslim majority liberal democracies that consistently protect minority and religious rights. We take this for granted as a situation we've all lived in America, at least for the past 70, 80 years, in every Western European country, and Canada for as long as we can think of, in Australia. But this is not, there are no examples of this in Arab Muslim majority countries. And every attempt at it ends with either a civil war, a failed state, or an officially Islamic country in which religious minorities are second-class citizens. And so it beggars belief for me to think that the first example of the success story is going to be with the Jews, who, in addition to whatever is plaguing the rest of Arab Muslim majority countries, which makes liberal democracies not work, have, in addition to that, the 75 or 80 years, really 100 years of psychological baggage on both sides of this conflict. So that's the first element.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, respond to that.
So it's, first of all, there seems to be something a little ironic about the fact that you're saying that we can't try to implement the principle of equality in the law in Israel, which is now classified as an apartheid state by the world's leading human rights organizations and its own leading human rights organizations, which fundamentally violates the principle of liberal democracy for Palestinians because it might not succeed as a liberal democracy. It's not a liberal democracy for Palestinians now. The second point I would make is that the arguments you're making, it's
The only reason it's not is because the Palestinians want to destroy Israel, Peter. You're so fucking dense. It's just because it's because you at the core are a weakling. That's just the sad reality. You're a weakling. That's what happens when you're a weakling. You know, you don't have the ability, Peter, to cause violence, and so therefore you believe that everything can be solved by nonviolent means. That unfortunately is not the case all the time. I for one wish it was, but I'm not dense enough to think that it is.
really striking. They are virtually identical to the arguments that white South Africans made in the 1980s. They looked at the African continent and they said, do you see any democracies? Do you see any thriving countries? We see dictatorships and civil wars. And you know what's interesting? Black South Africans saw the same Africa. They saw the same problems, but they didn't buy into the idea that there was something essential about Africa that made democracy impossible. They understood that there was a legacy, particular legacy of colonialism in the Cold War that led countries, whether they be Nigeria, Congo, Kenya, Zimbabwe, to have their particular path. And it's fascinating. You know, I know you interviewed Youssef. And he told you, because I listened, it was a really good conversation. I'm really glad you did. He basically said exactly what I said, that about the idea of equality under the law. I suspect, Coleman, if you interviewed 100 Palestinians that you just chose by asking Palestinians like who they like, you would find 98 or 99 of them said the same thing. And it wouldn't be because they don't understand that Syria and the UAE and Saudi Arabia have tons of problems, but because they don't believe that they understand those problems, that lack of democracy, as a product of particular historical contingency, in significant measure that the powers that be, most of all the United States, have never wanted those countries to be democracies. Look at how America's strongest client states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, responded to the Arab Spring. Look at how the US has responded to the Arab Spring by trying to sabotage efforts at democracy again and again and again. And that's why these arguments that suggest there's something essential about a country because it's Arab or Muslim or whatever, that it can't be a liberal democracy, I just think are as wrong there as they were in the South Africa case.
So it doesn't have to be something essential. And I don't really have to have a theory of it in order to observe that it simply hasn't worked in the most comparable and therefore most relevant cases.
I don't
in the
think
case of South Africa, hold on. In the case of South Africa, you don't, well, okay, but what comparison cases do we have except for the populations that are most similar in terms of religion and culture and so forth? Democracy has been extremely unstable and extremely dangerous for religious minorities throughout the Middle East period. And so that's the Bayesian base case for what happens in a one-state Israel-Palestine. And again, you add to that the enormous level of psychological baggage on each side and the lack of trust, and that actually makes it an even worse case than Lebanon, Iraq, and so forth. What's more, there's a very important variable that didn't exist in South Africa, which is religion and specific religious doctrines around jihad and sacred sites. So according to Benny Morris, the massacres of Jews in 1920 and 1929, when 130 Jews were killed in Hebron, were partly triggered by the accusation that the Jews were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque and replace it and rebuild the Third Temple, right? This obviously was not true at the time. There are some Jewish extremists you can find that will talk about this, right? But there was no organized plan to do that. And that was sufficient cause to massacre Jews in the 1920s. It is also, as it happens, one of Hamas's 100 years later justifications for October 7th. We call it October 7th. They call it the Al-Aqsa Flood. Why? Because they justify it in the name of the Jews are planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque and replace it with the Third Temple, right? So one of the variables that really militates against success in the case of a binational state where everyone has equal rights is the fact that this fear, which is seen by Hamas militants as sufficient justification for murdering Jewish civilians, is not going to go away in a binational state. They're still going. If everyone has freedom of movement and including Jews, Jews can pray at the Western Wall, and it's a liberal democracy, just like we have in America. Hamas is going to be just as paranoid, to whatever degree that they are, about Jews destroying Al-Aqsa Temple and destroying Al-Aqsa Mosque and replacing it with a temple. And they've already proven for 100 years that that's a sufficient justification for the murder of Jews. And that jihadist millenarian ideology That is not something that was present in South Africa, and it makes it a very bad comparison.
So first of all, no, I don't think that Hamas, whatever fantasies they have, I don't think Hamas or other Palestinians will be nearly as afraid, because under equality of law, Palestinians have rights. They can vote. The reason Palestinians are afraid that East Jerusalem will become the equivalent of Hebron, or that the Al-Aqsa will become the equivalent of the cave of the Machpelah, which is both sacred to Jews and Muslims, where Israeli settlers have encroached, is Palestinians have no rights. When Palestinians have rights and are represented in government, actually, the fear that their needs can be completely overturned is actually, I think, goes way down.
You're so naive, Peter Beinart. Like, you're just so naive. It's such a naivete. I can't listen to this nonsense anymore. It's just. All right, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed this video with Coleman and Peter, as well as my commentary. If you haven't yet subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, like the video, leave your comments. I would love to be of assistance for any of your South Florida real estate needs, and it would mean so much to me if you were to support the channel by clicking on the Buy Me a Coffee link, either in the pinned comment, or the description. I hope you will tune in to the next video. Until next time, peace.